everybody. Welcome back to another Thursday Tips and Tricks. I know it's been a while, but I've been pretty busy and I did need a little bit of a break. But I thought it's time to get back and do these tips and tricks on a more regular basis. I have heard from a lot of you that you really enjoy them, so let's pick up where we kind of left off. Now, this episode and the next several episodes of Tips and Tricks is going to revolve around what we call Tuckerizing. Now, what does that mean? Tuckerizing is a term that we coined in order to explain what we do all the time, either with designing our original designs or looking at someone else's pattern, taking designs, blocks, patterns, quilts, and figuring out ways that we can make them using Studio 180 design tools and processes. And we all know that these tools and processes are going to make your life easier. It's going to make your production more efficient, and it's going to give you better quilts in the end. Now, I'm flying solo today, so there's no one behind the camera. So what I need to do is turn the camera around and position it so we can look at a horizontal surface. So if you get vertigo, don't just close your eyes for a minute while I turn this around. You're all getting a chance to see my busy, crazy studio, but I'm turning this around so that I can then drop this down and we can take a look at a horizontal surface. And guess what we're working with today? It's pretty obvious. We're going to be working with half square triangles using the Tucker trimmer and learning how to Tuckerize some patterns that are found in a recent magazine. Now, throughout the course of these next couple of episodes, you are going to hear me repeat 3 words on a regular basis: recognize, analyze, and Tuckerize. Recognize means being able to look at a block, at a pattern, at a project, and recognize the shape, the unit, or the blocks that it's made with so that you can determine whether you can indeed Tuckerize and use Studio 180 design tools. Analyze means figuring out the particulars. Sometimes you can use the clues that are in a pattern, figuring out which is the correct tool to be used with the different shape or unit or block, what the required size is for the shape to be able to make the project exactly the same as what's pictured in your pattern or in the magazine. Understand the difference between finished sizes and unfinished sizes, and maybe make changes either to the construction process or to the size of the piece that you're finishing. And then Tuckerize, applying what you know to be able to adjust the pattern cutting sizes so that your pieces will be oversized and you get to trim them down, and possibly adjust the construction methods, but always make better quilts. So recognize, analyze, and Tuckerize. So now that we've got the basics of what we're doing, let me take a minute and move this stuff out of the way and bring in an example of what you probably are working with for future projects or a current project. This is a magazine. This is American Patchwork and Quilting. It's issue 171. So if you see something in here you like, you can probably get in touch with them and still get this in hand. But I know I have not opened a magazine in the last probably 35 years that hasn't had at least one project in it that has those half square triangles. So let's take a look at what we have. When I open up the first project that I've discovered in the magazine that had half square triangles, here it is, and you can see there's a little diagram there that I'm making half square triangles. Now, what is the pattern telling me to do? The pattern is actually telling me, when I look through the cutting instructions, to cut squares 1 7/8 of an inch. Now, many of you do this already. Take that 1 7/8 inch increment for the size squares that they expect you to be able to cut perfectly, position perfectly, mark perfectly, stitch perfectly, and then you'll end up with all perfect units at the end. But you probably, and I always, take that 1 7/8 inch and Tuckerize it and make it a 2-inch square. It's easier to cut, and it gives me a little bit of wiggle room so that when I'm done then, I get to trim each square down to a precision size. And the trim size, if it's a 1 7/8 inch pattern telling you that, is I'm going to trim it to 1.5 inches. Now, how do I know that? Well, if you look at this particular project, it tells you each triangle square should be 1.5 inches, including the seam allowance. So that's the unfinished size. That's the cut size that I would use with the Tucker trimmer. I would use that half circle side of the ruler and cut them to 1.5 inches, so that when I'm all done, the finished size of each of those little squares is going to be 1 inch. So that's our first example of Tuckerizing half square triangles. And the clue, the big clue often is that 7/8 of an inch size that they tell you to cut. Now I'm going to go to the back of the project and we're going to take a look at another pattern in here. And when we look at this, there's lots of half square triangles. There's half square triangles in the blocks, and then there's also half square triangles around the outside edge. What is the pattern telling me to cut? Well, for the small blocks or the interior blocks, what the pattern is telling me to cut are squares that are 2 3/8 of an inch. Now, it's not 7/8 of an inch. It's 3/8 of an inch. And those two numbers, those 7/8 and the 3/8, are big clues that somewhere in the project, there are going to be half square triangles turned into squares. The 7/8 of an inch, the finished size would end up being a whole inch block. For something that they have you cut 2 3/8, the finished size of each of those little squares is actually going to be 1.5 inches. So how do we Tuckerize this? That 2 3/8 inch that I don't want to cut, I bump up to 2.5 inches, making it easier, making them oversized, so that when the marking, the stitching, and the pressing are done, then I can trim them to the precision or to the size that I need. And that trim size is 2 inches. Again, how do I know that? It tells me right here, each triangle square should be 2 inches, including the seam allowances. That's a 2-inch unfinished unit, and making each one of those little pieces finish when all is done, to 1.5 inches. Let's take a look at another one. This one also has that 3/8 of an inch, and it pattern says cut the squares 3 3/8. 3 3/8 is just under 3.5. So I'm going to bump the size of those squares for those units in the project to 3.5, trim them to 3 inches. It's telling me right there, and then finish to 2.5. But you know, sometimes a pattern may not have this little valuable piece of information that should be 3 inches unfinished. Well, here's what I would do if I saw 3 3/8 and I didn't know exactly what size unit it was going to turn out to be. When you open up your Tucker Trimmer set of instructions, there's a very valuable chart in there. And if you know some things, you can figure out other things by just referring to this chart. If the 3 3/8, I know I want to bump up to 3.5. The 3.5 inch is the cut size of the half square triangle squares that I want to make. So when I look at this and the cut size, the starter squares that I'm going to do are 3.5 inches, and I follow this over and find that those starter squares of 3.5 inches. Then I can follow up to see that the cut size of the units will be 3 inches and the finished size will be 2.5. So between the information that you see in the pattern, in the magazine, and the information that you can glean from looking at your charts, you are going to be able to accurately Tuckerize these projects. Now, believe it or not, there are still 2 more projects in here that I want to address. This one is pretty easy. Cutting instructions say 4 7/8. 4 7/8, I'm going to bump up to 5. 5 inch, these are kind of fun. This is a perfect project to use with those charm squares. I don't know about you, I've got packages of those all over the place. But I can then team them up with background squares that I cut that are 5 inches, mark my diagonals, stitch on those diagonals, and create slightly oversized units so that I can then trim them to 4.5, and they will all finish to 4 inches, exactly the correct size to go on and build this wonderful quilt. And there's one more in here. Now see, this is all in one magazine. It's amazing how many times half square triangles show up in projects. This one, again, tells me to cut 2 7/8. So I'm going to bump those squares up to 3, and they have me cut 240 2 7/8 inch squares. Create all my units and then trim each one down. Well, I could do that. And the question is, do I want to do that? I didn't really want to do that because I know there is a better, quicker way. And we actually have a technique sheet out there called 8 at once. And this is a method that allows you to determine what size unit that I need to make. I need to trim it to 2.5, meaning that it's going to finish to 2. When I pull out my 8 at once technique sheet, it will give me the size large squares, pink and red, that I can cut to be able to make 8 half square triangles at one time by stitching on 2 diagonals this way, stitching on 2 diagonals this way, cutting on the north and south and the east and west. I create boatloads of those half square triangle units. And because I've used the size squares that are listed on my chart, that means those squares are going to be slightly oversized, allowing me to trim them down and clean each one up so that I end up with units measuring exactly 2 inches. I end up with better blocks, and I end up with a higher success rate. So there you have it in just one magazine. 5 different projects that use those half square triangles. And you would be tuckerizing somebody else's pattern there. But if you purchase one of our patterns, this quilt that's on the long arm is actually our green belt project. It was designed by one of our certified instructor, Rosella Hansen. Half square triangles don't have to be boring. There are lots of really great designs out there that use half square triangles. And I hope that going forward, you take time to examine your patterns before you do the cutting. Because if you cut all those 242 7/8 inch squares, you're pretty much locked into doing them the way they tell you in the magazine. Knowledge is power, and be a powerful quilter. Look, recognize, analyze what they're telling you to do, analyze what you need to do, and then adjust your pattern cutting instructions so that you can create better quilts easier and more efficiently than you ever thought possible. So that's lesson 1, half square triangles and the Tucker trimmer on Tuckerizing. The next episode, we're going to take this one step further, and we're going to work on hourglass units, which are quarter square triangles. So I'll see you then. Everybody take care and look for those half square triangles that you can Tuckerize in your future projects. Bye, everybody.